Sergei had been working the evening shift at the shopping center, just like any other day. The work was monotonous, but it kept things stable. Bills paid, fridge stocked, life manageable. And then there was Anya, his wife of just over a year. Sometimes, as Sergei walked through the aisles, he'd pause, catching a glimpse of her at the clothing store down the hall. Her laughter floated through the air, light and easy as she charmed customers. It was a sound he used to take pride in, thinking it was meant for him. That night, something was off. On his usual round, he noticed the cleaning closet door ajar. It wasn't like the staff to leave things messy. Sergei stepped in to close it, but his eyes caught a flash of color on the corkboard above the mops and disinfectants, a Polaroid pinned carelessly there. He moved closer, squinting at the grainy image, and his heart stopped. The air grew thick, the world narrowing to that single photo. There was no mistaking it. Anya. His Anya. She was completely exposed, her body pressed against another man's. The man's face, young, cocky, belonged to Vadim, the smug employee from a neighboring clothing store. The couch in the background looked disturbingly familiar. The staff lounge. Sergei's chest tightened. He felt a rush of heat and cold all at once, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. How long? Had it started before they were married? Every late shift, every tired evening when he thought she was waiting for him at home. Was she laughing at him? He pulled the photo off the board, the paper cool in his trembling fingers. Slipping it into his jacket pocket, Sergei turned and left the closet, his footsteps steady even though his mind was spinning. For now, he'd pretend everything was fine. He needed time to think, to process what he'd just seen. And more than anything, he needed a plan. I didn't sleep that night. Not even a minute. I sat on the edge of our bed, the Polaroid still in my pocket, staring at the darkened room around me. Anya lay next to me, her breathing steady and peaceful, completely unaware of the storm tearing through me. She looked so innocent when she slept, her hair messy against the pillow, her lips slightly parted. It was a cruel trick of the universe, making her look like the same woman I fell in love with, even when I knew now that she wasn't. I thought about reaching out, shaking her awake, and asking her outright, why? But the anger was too raw, too close to the surface. If I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out. Instead, I got up quietly and walked to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water. Every sip felt like swallowing glass. Questions kept circling in my head, looping over and over. Was it my fault? Was I working too much? Had I missed something obvious? I hated myself for even thinking like that. She made a choice. A deliberate one. And now, so would I. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. She was good at lying. Had to be, to pull this off. If I charged in without proof or a plan, she'd twist the truth, play the victim. Maybe even make me out to be the bad guy. No, I needed to be smart. Careful. I needed more than just one photo. When Anya woke up, she stretched lazily, a soft smile on her face. I forced myself to look at her without flinching. Morning, she murmured, leaning over to kiss my cheek. I let her. My stomach churned, but I kept my face neutral. Morning, I said, keeping my voice steady. You were up early, she added, glancing at me curiously. I shrugged. Couldn't sleep. She didn't press. She never did when it came to me. I guess she assumed I was just the quiet, hard-working husband who didn't ask for much. It probably made me the perfect person to cheat on. The day passed like any other. She went to work, her usual sunny self, while I went back to the mall for another shift. Every time I passed the clothing store where Vadim worked, I caught myself glancing inside. He wasn't there. It wasn't until later in the evening that I saw him. He was standing by the entrance, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. I watched him laugh at something one of his coworkers said, his arrogance radiating in waves. I hated how familiar he looked to me now. I could see his face so clearly from the Polaroid, the way he had looked at her. It wasn't casual. There was no hesitation in that photo, no shame. He wasn't just some random fling. He knew exactly what he was doing. For a moment, I thought about marching right over and confronting him. But I stopped myself. If I let him see me angry, it would tip him off. So instead, I just stood there, watching. I watched the way he moved, the way he smiled, the way he carried himself like he had nothing to lose. Later that night, Anya was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, when I brought it up, casually, like I was just making conversation. Do you know Vadim? That guy who works at the store down the hall. Anya's hand froze for a fraction of a second before she continued brushing. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I wasn't most people anymore. I was watching her like a hawk. Oh yeah, I think I've seen him around, she said, her voice muffled through the toothpaste. Seems like a young guy. You ever talk to him? She rinsed her mouth and turned to me with a raised eyebrow. Why the sudden interest? No reason, I said with a shrug, keeping my tone light. Just making conversation. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, no. I mean, I've probably said hi a couple of times, but that's it. I nodded, pretending to let it go, but inside, I felt a cold, hard knot settle in my chest. She was lying. And now I knew for sure. Her lies weren't just words, they were bricks, building a wall between us. And the worst part was, I'd spent the last year and a half of my life helping her lay the foundation. The next few days were agony. Every word Anya said to me felt like a test. Every smile, every touch, every laugh, it all felt rehearsed, fake. And yet, I couldn't let her see that I knew. Not yet. Instead, I did what I always did. Worked my shift, came home, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But normal was long gone. That Polaroid stayed with me, tucked deep inside a drawer in our bedroom where she wouldn't think to look. Every so often, I'd pull it out, staring at it like it could give me answers. It didn't, of course. It just made the questions worse. One evening, as I was closing up at work, I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. Two of the cleaning staff were chatting by the entrance, their voices low but audible. Did you hear about Vadim? One of them said. Yeah, the guy's got some nerve, the other replied. You know he's been fooling around with that married woman, right? From the boutique. My stomach dropped. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, pretending to check the locks on the doors. Oh yeah, the first one said with a chuckle. Real bold, that one. He's been bragging about it in the break room. Says her husband's clueless. Their laughter faded as they walked away, but the damage was done. My hands gripped the keys so tight I thought they might snap. So it wasn't just me. It wasn't just a photo in a closet. People knew. People were talking. And Vadim. He was proud of it. When I got home that night, Anya was already in bed, scrolling through her phone. I leaned against the doorway, watching her. She didn't even notice me at first. Long day, she asked, glancing up with a casual smile. I nodded, stepping into the room. Yeah, a long one. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor for a moment before I looked at her. Hey, you ever hear what people say about you at work? Her smile faltered, just for a second, before she recovered. What? No. Why? You know how people gossip. I shrugged, forcing a laugh. Figured you might have heard something. She narrowed her eyes slightly, like she was trying to figure out what I was getting at. But she didn't take the bait. Nope. Haven't heard a thing. Liar. I kissed her goodnight, but as I lay in bed beside her, my mind was racing. It was one thing for her to cheat. It was disgusting, unforgivable. But to have people laughing behind my back? To have Vadim turning it into some kind of sick joke? No. That wasn't going to fly. The next day, I skipped my usual routine and swung by the boutique during Anya's shift. I kept my distance, leaning against a railing near the escalator where I could see her but she couldn't see me. She looked normal. Like nothing was wrong. Smiling at customers, folding clothes, chatting with her coworkers. It made me sick how effortlessly she wore that mask. Then, like clockwork, Vadim appeared. He strutted past the store, glancing inside like he was checking for her. When their eyes met, Anya's smile faltered just slightly. It wasn't much, but I caught it. I watched as he kept walking, circling back a few minutes later. This time, he lingered by the entrance. Anya excused herself from her coworker and stepped out, her voice low as they exchanged a few words. It was quick, just a minute or two, but the way she looked at him, the way she laughed at something he said, it was like they had their own little world. I clenched the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. That evening, Anya came home later than usual. She claimed she had stayed late to help with inventory, but her excuse felt as flimsy as paper. Over dinner, I tested the waters. How's work? Busy day. Exhausting, she replied, stabbing at her salad. I'm dead on my feet. You didn't run into Vadim today, did you? I asked, keeping my tone light. Her fork froze mid-air. Vadim, she repeated, her voice tight. Yeah, I said, feigning curiosity. I thought I saw him walking around when I came by the mall earlier. She blinked, then quickly shook her head. No, I didn't see him. I was stuck in the back most of the day. Another lie. And not even a good one. I said, nodding slowly. Funny, I thought you two might have bumped into each other. He seems like the type to hang around. Her eyes darted to mine, just for a moment, before she forced a laugh. Why are you so interested in Vadim all of a sudden? Just curious, I said with a shrug. But inside, I was already planning my next move. If they thought they could keep this up, if they thought they could keep lying to me, they were dead wrong. I spent the next week watching and waiting. Every moment with Anya felt like a battle between what I wanted to believe and what I knew to be true. She'd still smile at me, still brush her hand across my shoulder as she passed, still kiss me goodnight. And every time, it felt like she was driving a knife deeper into my chest. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I started gathering details, piecing together the gaps in their little game. I paid closer attention to her schedule, her excuses, and her habits. The lies weren't hard to spot once I knew what to look for. One evening, after Anya went to bed early, I picked up her phone. It was risky, but I couldn't stop myself. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages. Most of it looked normal. Chats with her coworkers, her sister, a couple of friends. But then I found one. A thread with no name attached, just a phone number. The messages weren't incriminating on the surface. Short, casual, but they were suspicious. Him. Break tomorrow? Her. Maybe. I'll see if I can get away. Or. Her. Thanks for the laugh earlier. I needed it. Him. You know I'm good for that anytime. It was him. I didn't have to see his name to know it was Vadim. I wanted to smash the phone right there. Instead, I took a deep breath and copied the number into mine. I'd deal with him later. For now, I needed to make sure Anya didn't suspect anything. So I put her phone back exactly where I found it and went to bed. The next morning, I made my move. I waited until Anya left for her shift, then called the number I'd found. It rang twice before a voice answered. Vadim's voice, smug and cocky. Hello. For a second, I didn't say anything. Just hearing him made my blood boil. Vadim, I said finally, keeping my tone calm. This is Sergey. There was a pause, then a laugh. Sergey. Do I know you? You know my wife, I said sharply. Another pause. This time, the laugh was nervous. Look man, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I snapped, my voice cold. I know exactly who you are, and I know what you've been doing. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay the hell away from her. No calls, no texts, no accidental run-ins at work. Do you understand me? His confidence cracked. Hey, I don't want any trouble. You've already got trouble, I interrupted. If I see you near her again, you'll regret it. This is your one warning. I hung up before he could say another word, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. That evening, Anya came home smiling, as if everything was fine. How was your day? She asked, hanging her bag by the door. I shrugged, forcing myself to sound casual. Same as always. Yours. Busy, she said, walking into the kitchen. You know how it is. I watched her carefully, waiting for any sign that she knew about my call to Vadim. But she acted like nothing had happened. And maybe, for her, it hadn't. She didn't know yet that the walls were closing in. That her little secret was hanging by a thread. But she would. Soon. The next day, I stopped by the mall on my break. I wasn't there to shop. I was there to see if Vadim had listened. Sure enough, I spotted him near the food court, chatting with a group of coworkers. He didn't see me at first, too busy cracking jokes and flashing that same arrogant grin. But then his eyes met mine, and the smile vanished. I didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared at him. He shifted uncomfortably, muttering something to his friends before walking off. Good. Let him sweat. But as I watched him disappear into the crowd, I realized this wasn't over. Not yet. Vadim might have backed off for now, but Anya, she was still lying to me. Still sneaking around. And until I had her backed into a corner with no way out, I couldn't rest. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she couldn't lie her way out of this. Vadim's reaction told me he was shaken, but not enough. His arrogance wouldn't just disappear with one warning. And Anya. She seemed entirely unaffected, going about her day like nothing had changed. That evening, I decided to dig deeper into her routine. I left work early, telling her I had to stay late. Instead, I parked near the back entrance of the mall, the one the staff used. From there, I had a clear view of the door. It wasn't long before I saw her. She stepped out, looking around nervously before heading toward the cafe down the street. My heart pounded as I followed at a distance. She walked in and sat at a corner table. Moments later, Vadim arrived, sliding into the seat across from her. They leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones, their body language painfully intimate. I stayed outside, watching through the window. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just some harmless flirting or a misunderstanding. They were completely comfortable in their betrayal. When they left, they didn't walk together. Anya returned to the mall while Vadim disappeared down a side street. They thought they were being clever, covering their tracks. But I had seen enough. That night, when I got home, I couldn't even look at her. The lies were piling up so high I could barely breathe. Yet I forced myself to act normal. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. Something she couldn't explain away. The anger burned hotter now, but I kept it buried. My time would come. The next morning, I made a decision. If I was going to confront Anya, I needed evidence she couldn't deny. My word against hers wasn't enough. She'd spin the story, paint me as paranoid, or worse, try to turn it all on me. I reached out to someone I trusted, Victor, one of the security guards at the mall. Victor and I weren't close friends, but we'd shared enough shifts to build a quiet understanding. He was the type who saw everything but rarely spoke about it. I figured if anyone could help me, it was him. When I approached him, I kept it vague at first, asking about the security cameras near the staff lounge. I framed it like I was concerned about theft, but Victor saw right through me. He asked a few pointed questions, and I eventually told him the truth, at least the part about suspecting my wife was meeting someone in the lounge. Victor didn't press me for details. He simply nodded and promised to check the footage. That evening, I got a text from him, a short video clip attached. My hands trembled as I opened it. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Anya and Vadim, sitting on the couch in the lounge. He leaned toward her, his hand brushing her arm, and she didn't pull away. They were laughing, too close, too familiar. It wasn't as damning as the Polaroid, but it was enough. Enough to confront her. Enough to take control of this nightmare. I thanked Victor, pocketing the video for safekeeping. I wasn't going to show it to her just yet. No, I wanted to see how far she'd go to lie when she was cornered. For now, I'd let her think I was still in the dark. But the cracks were starting to show, and I could feel the moment building when it would all come crashing down. That weekend, I decided to test Anya's limits. I suggested we spend Sunday together. A quiet day at home, just the two of us. She hesitated at first, claiming she might have errands to run, but I pressed her gently until she agreed. I watched her closely that morning. She seemed restless, checking her phone more often than usual. When I stepped out to the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of her typing furiously on her screen. By the time I returned, she was all smiles, pretending nothing had happened. Around noon, she told me she needed to pick up a few things from the grocery store. It wasn't unusual, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but as soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She didn't go to the store. Instead, she parked in the lot behind the mall and walked toward the staff entrance. My chest tightened as I watched her disappear inside. I waited for a few minutes before following. Inside, the place was quiet, most shops closed for the day. I made my way toward the staff lounge, keeping out of sight. When I got close, I heard voices, hers and Vadim's, low and urgent. I didn't go in. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, not without undeniable proof in my hands. Instead, I stood there, listening as my wife's betrayal played out just beyond the door. When the voices stopped, I quickly retreated, slipping out before they could see me. Back in my car, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't just a gut feeling or a grainy photo. This was real. Anya was meeting him behind my back, lying to my face, and treating me like a fool. That evening, she came home with a bag of groceries, acting like nothing had happened. I said nothing, forcing myself to play the role of the oblivious husband one last time. But inside I was done. I wasn't going to wait any longer. The time for patience was over. It was time for her lies to catch up with her. The next day, I prepared myself for the confrontation. My anger was a steady fire now, controlled but intense. I didn't plan on shouting or losing control. No, I wanted her to see the truth unfold and watch her struggle to explain it. When Anya came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room. I'd placed the Polaroid on the coffee table, along with my phone showing the video Victor had sent me. She barely glanced at me as she walked in, slipping off her shoes. "Hey," she said casually, heading toward the kitchen. "Anya, come sit," I said, my voice firm but calm. She froze for a moment, her back to me. Then she turned, frowning slightly. "What's this about?" "Just sit," I repeated, motioning to the couch. She hesitated, but eventually did as I asked. Her eyes flicked to the Polaroid on the table, her expression changing instantly. A mix of panic and defiance flashed across her face, and she quickly looked back at me. "What is that?" she asked, trying to sound confused. "You tell me," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Because I've been trying to figure it out." She picked up the Polaroid, her hands trembling slightly. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" I said. "I want to hear your explanation." For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at the photo. Then she let out a shaky laugh. "This isn't what it looks like. It's some kind of joke. I don't even know." I cut her off, sliding my phone across the table so she could see the video. Her face paled as she watched it, her breath hitching. "Still a joke?" I asked. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she looked up at me, her expression hardening. "You've been spying on me?" The audacity of her words hit me like a slap. "Spying on you?" I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. "You've been sneaking around, meeting Vadim, lying to my face, and you think I'm the one who's out of line?" She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, realizing she had nothing to say. The silence between us was heavy, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of us. Finally, she shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Sergey, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her voice was soft now, pleading. But I wasn't going to let her manipulate me, not this time. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" I said, standing up. "You didn't mean to cheat on me? To betray me? To let him humiliate me in front of the whole mall?" She flinched at that, the reality of what she'd done finally sinking in. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, not just fear of losing me, but fear of what her actions had done to her carefully constructed image. I walked to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to her. "I don't know what kind of person you are anymore, Anya. But I'm done being your fool." With that, I left the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. I spent the night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. Every fiber of me wanted to walk out of the house and never come back, but I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. She didn't get to sweep this under the rug, not after everything. The next morning, Anya tried to act like nothing had happened. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and even asked if I wanted breakfast. I didn't answer, barely sparing her a glance as I grabbed my keys and left. At work, I couldn't focus. The usual rhythm of my tasks felt meaningless. The betrayal gnawed at me, threatening to spill over into everything I did. Coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual, but I waved off their questions with forced smiles. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted Victor, asking for one more favor. He didn't ask questions, just told me to meet him after his shift. That evening, Victor handed me a USB drive. "The footage from the last few weeks," he said, his tone neutral. I thanked him and left quickly, not wanting to explain myself further. At home, I waited until Anya was in the shower before plugging the drive into my laptop. My stomach churned as I watched clip after clip of her and Vadim in the staff lounge. Their meetings were short but consistent, always careful, always just on the edge of what could be considered innocent. But there was one clip that sealed it. It was from last week. Anya and Vadim sat close on the couch, talking in low voices. He leaned toward her, whispering something that made her laugh. Then he reached for her hand, holding it for a moment before pulling her into a brief but unmistakable kiss. I paused the video, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. This was it. The final proof. When Anya came out of the shower, I was waiting for her in the living room again, the laptop open on the coffee table. She froze when she saw me, her face pale. "You've been lying to me for months," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I have the footage. I have everything." She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "Don't bother denying it, Anya. I know what you've been doing. I know what you are." Her mask crumbled. She didn't cry this time, didn't plead. Instead, she sank into the couch, her head in her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "Hurting me was never the problem, was it?" I replied, standing up. "You just didn't think you'd get caught." Her silence told me everything I needed to know. For the first time in months, I felt something close to clarity. I wasn't going to let her lies define me anymore. I wasn't going to stay in a marriage built on betrayal and deceit. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. "We'll talk about what happens next later," I said without looking back. Her voice followed me as I walked out, broken and desperate. But I didn't stop. Not this time.